The morning ended the way it began, quietly, too quietly. By late afternoon, the sun hung low over the fields, casting long shadows across the muddy ground. The workers were dismissed one by one, heads down, shoulders slumped, eyes trained on the dirt as if looking up might cost them something they could no longer afford to lose. The plantation returned to its familiar stillness, that heavy, suffocating silence that followed cruelty like a shadow. But something had changed. The woman remained where she had fallen. Mud clung to her dress. Blood dried along her forearm. Her breathing was shallow, uneven, each breath a small victory against the weight pressing down on her chest. Around her, the earth bore witness, footprints, torn grass, marks left behind by boots and arrogance and unchecked power. No one helped her, not because they didn't care, but because fear had taught them how to survive. She lay there long after the twins had ridden away, their laughter still echoing faintly in the distance, as if cruelty itself had learned how to linger. To them it was over, another lesson taught, another reminder delivered, another human reduced to an object and left behind without a second thought. They never looked back. Minutes passed. Then more. The sky shifted colors, pale blue giving way to amber, amber fading toward gray. Somewhere nearby, a bird cried out and fell silent again. Life moved on, as it always did, indifferent to suffering that had become routine. Then, slowly, painfully, the woman moved. Her fingers twitched first, digging into the wet soil as if the earth itself were the only thing willing to hold her. She drew in a breath that burned her lungs and coughed, mud splattering beneath her chin. Every muscle screamed in protest as she rolled onto her side. Standing felt impossible, but staying down felt worse. She pushed herself up inch by inch, shaking, unsteady, swaying as though a single gust of wind might knock her back into the dirt. Her vision blurred. The world tilted. Still she stood. No cheers followed. No help came. Only the quiet. For a moment she simply stood there, letting the pain settle, letting the weight of what had happened sink in. This wasn't the first time she had been hurt. It wasn't even the worst. But something about this day felt different, final, like a door had closed behind her without warning. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and looked around the empty field. Where there had been witnesses hours earlier, there was now only absence, silence, the kind that presses against your ears until your own thoughts become too loud to ignore. That was when she whispered his name. It barely left her lips, a sound softer than the breeze, a name she had not spoken aloud in years. Her son, memories flooded in without permission. A boy with broad shoulders even as a child, hands too large for his body, eyes that watched everything, quietly, intensely. A boy who never cried at loud noises, never turned when his name was called, never heard the world the way others did. A boy the others feared long before they understood why. They had called him strange, dangerous, cursed. They had whispered that his silence meant something was wrong with him. They had been right, just not in the way they thought. He had grown fast, too fast, taller, stronger, heavier with each passing year. By 16, he stood over men twice his age, and when trouble came, when cruelty crept too close, he didn't shout or beg or run. He watched, and one day he was gone. Some said he had escaped, others said he had been sold. A few claimed he had died. No one ever knew the truth, and the woman had learned not to ask questions that led nowhere. Until now. She steadied herself and took a step forward, then another. Pain shot through her leg, sharp and immediate, but she didn't stop. Each step felt like walking through fire, yet something stronger than pain pulled her onward. Hope, not the fragile kind, the desperate kind. The sun dipped lower as she made her way off the field and toward the dirt road that cut through the land like an old scar. The plantation faded behind her, its fences and buildings shrinking into silhouettes against the horizon. She did not look back. With every step, her mind replayed the morning, the twins' faces, their voices, the casual way they had looked at her, not as a person, not even as a problem, but as nothing at all. They had believed they were untouchable. They had believed the world would always bend around them. They had believed no consequences existed beyond their own boredom. That belief had carried them through life without resistance. But beliefs, like empires, only last until they are tested. The road stretched ahead, uneven and unforgiving. Her body begged her to stop, to rest, to lie down and let the world continue without her. She ignored it. Somewhere deep inside, beneath years of fear and submission, something old stirred awake, a mother's resolve. As darkness crept closer, she reached the edge of He Woods. The air grew cooler. The sounds changed. Crickets chirped. Leaves rustled. Shadows lengthened, swallowing the path until it felt like she was walking into the unknown itself. She stumbled, caught herself, kept moving. Every few steps she paused to breathe, leaning against a tree or resting her hand on a fence post. Time lost meaning. Distance blurred. All that mattered was forward. At last, long after the sun had disappeared completely, she saw it, a structure at the edge of the land, isolated, forgotten, half swallowed by the trees that had grown wild around it. Light flickered faintly through a crack in the wood, weak but unmistakable. Her heart pounded. She took one final step and collapsed. Her body hit the ground hard, the last of her strength spent. For a moment, there was nothing. No sound, no movement, just the quiet hum of night settling in. Then, from inside, something shifted. Heavy footsteps approached the door, slow, measured, each one deliberate, as if whoever walked did not rush for anything, not even emergencies. The door creaked open. A massive shadow filled the frame. The figure stepped forward into the dim light, towering over her fallen body. Broad shoulders stretched the fabric of his shirt. Arms thick with muscle hung at his sides, scarred and marked by a life that had not been gentle. His face remained unreadable, carved from restraint rather than emotion. He looked down at her. He did not call out. He did not gasp. He did not make a sound. But something in him changed. He knelt beside her, placing 2 fingers against her neck. He could not hear her breathing, but he felt the faint rhythm beneath her skin, alive. Barely. His jaw tightened. Ed. Carefully, as if she were made of glass. He lifted her from the ground. She stirred weakly, eyes fluttering open for just a second. When she saw him, her lips parted. She smiled, a smile full of relief and recognition. Tears slid down her face as she raised a trembling hand and touched his cheek. Her fingers traced a line along his jaw, as if confirming he was real. He leaned into her touch, eyes closing briefly. Home. Inside the small structure, he laid her down gently and cleaned her wounds in silence. Every bruise, every cut, every mark told a story he did not need to hear to understand. His movements were controlled, precise, but his hands shook just enough to betray what he felt beneath the surface. When she woke fully, she told him everything the only way she could, with gestures, with expressions, with broken movements that carried more meaning than words ever could. She showed him the field, the men, the pain. She showed him the faces of the twins. As she spoke, his posture changed, his back straightened, his eyes hardened, not with blind rage, but with clarity, purpose. He listened without interruption, without reaction. When she finished, the room fell silent again. Then he stood. No threats were spoken, no promises made, none were needed. He turned toward the door, his shadow stretching long across the floor. Outside, the night waited, calm and unaware of what it had just set into motion. 3 hours earlier, the twins had believed the day was finished. They were wrong, because some mornings do not end when the sun goes down. Some mornings create consequences, and somewhere in the darkness, justice had just found its shape. The twins slept well that night. That alone said everything about the kind of men they were. While the plantation settled into darkness, while pain lingered in the soil and fear clung to the air like humidity, the brothers rested comfortably beneath clean sheets and high ceilings. Their rooms were quiet, undisturbed by guilt or memory. Cruelty, when repeated often enough, becomes routine. And routine, when paired with power, feels like entitlement. Morning came easily to them. Sunlight poured through tall windows, illuminating polished furniture and imported rugs. The estate stirred awake with practiced efficiency. Servants moved quietly through hallways, preparing breakfast, opening shutters, setting the day in motion. Outside, horses were fed, gates unlocked, schedules resumed. Nothing felt different. One of the twins stretched and yawned, glancing out over the land they owned. Acres of fields, rows of laborers already lining up for work. Order restored, control intact. "Looks like yesterday taught its lesson," he said casually, lifting his cup. His brother chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "They always learn. That's the point." They spoke without malice, without heat, just certainty. To them, dominance wasn't something they questioned. It was something they inherited. They finished breakfast slowly, unhurried. Power had taught them patience. There was no rush when the world waited for you. But beyond the manicured lawns and carefully placed fences, something else had woken up with the dawn, something that did not belong to them. The giant stood motionless near the tree line, watching the estate from a distance. The morning light traced the outline of his massive frame, casting long shadows behind him. He had been there for some time, unmoving, eyes fixed on the house where the twins laughed and ate and planned their day. His mother rested behind him, safe for now, sleeping under a roof that had once been nothing more than a hiding place. Her breathing was steadier than it had been the night before, though pain still marked every inch of her body. He had made sure she would not wake alone. Then he had left. He did not carry a weapon. He did not need one. Back at the estate, the twins mounted their horses and rode out toward the fields, inspecting the day's work. This ritual reassured them. Seeing people fall back into line, seeing heads lowered and movements synchronized, reminded them that yesterday's cruelty had achieved its purpose. Fear was a tool, and tools, when used correctly, lasted. They passed rows of workers without acknowledging them, eyes scanning for hesitation, for defiance, for any sign that control might be slipping. They found none, or so they believed. One of the twins slowed his horse, pointing toward the far end of the field. "She's not there," he said. His brother followed his gaze. The spot where the woman had collapsed the day before sat empty, the ground disturbed but abandoned. "So?" the other replied. "She'll crawl back eventually. They always do." The words hung in the air, confident and dismissive. What they didn't see was the way the workers' eyes flickered, the way shoulders tensed, the way silence felt heavier than usual. Fear still ruled the field, but it was changing shape. By midday, the heat grew oppressive. The twins retreated to the shade near their estate, pouring drinks, laughing loudly. They spoke of business, of future profits, of guests expected later that week. Their lives moved forward unchallenged. They never noticed the absence. They never noticed the stillness. It was just after noon when the first sign appeared. A horse, untethered, wandered near the fence line. No rider, no saddle, just an animal moving aimlessly, eyes wide, breath uneven. One of the guards frowned but thought little of it. Then another horse appeared. Then another. Murmurs rippled through the yard. "Where are the handlers?" someone asked. No answer came. That was when the shadow crossed the ground, slow, heavy, unmistakable. One of the twins looked up, irritation creasing his face. "What now?" he muttered. At the edge of the property, emerging from the heat haze, stood the giant. He walked forward without haste, each step measured, deliberate. The earth seemed to respond to him, dirt shifting beneath his boots, grass bending under his weight. He did not look around. He did not scan for threats. His gaze remained fixed on the estate. On them. The laughter died instantly. Guards reached for weapons, uncertainty flashing across their faces. They had never seen someone like this before, not just in size but in presence. He did not carry himself like a runaway or a rebel. He carried himself like something inevitable. "Stop right there," one guard shouted. The giant did not react. Another guard stepped forward, voice trembling. "I said stop." Still nothing. He continued walking. The twins exchanged a glance, annoyance giving way to something sharper. "Handle this," one of them snapped. A guard raised his rifle and fired a warning shot into the air. The sound echoed across the estate, loud and sudden. The giant felt the vibration through the ground, through his bones. He did not flinch. Sound meant nothing to him. The threat meant nothing either. He kept coming. Panic spread. A second shot rang out, closer this time. The bullet struck the dirt several feet from the giant's feet. Dust rose and settled. He stopped. For the first time since appearing, he looked directly at the guard who had fired, and smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It wasn't cruel either. It was calm. That was what terrified them most. The guard's hands shook. He backed away instinctively. "He's not right," he whispered. The twins stepped forward now, trying to reassert control. "Who are you?" one demanded. "You don't belong here." The giant turned his attention to them. Recognition passed through his eyes. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand and pointed at them. The gesture was simple, almost polite, but the meaning was unmistakable. "You." A murmur spread through the gathered workers. Whispers turned into gasps as realization dawned. Some recognized him. Others only sensed what he represented. The twins felt it too. A chill crept up their spines, unfamiliar and unwelcome. They had never been pointed at like this before, never been singled out, never been seen. "Remove him," one twin ordered, voice sharper now. No one moved. The guards hesitated. The workers watched. The balance of the moment shifted, subtle but undeniable. Power, for the first time, wavered. The giant took another step forward, then another. No violence erupted, not yet. But something far more dangerous had begun: exposure. The giant reached into his coat and pulled out a worn piece of cloth. He held it up for all to see. Mud-stained, torn. The W. Oman's dress. A collective breath was drawn. He dropped it at the twins' feet. Silence followed, thick, heavy, unforgiving. Faces turned, eyes widened. Understanding spread like fire through dry grass. The story no longer belonged to whispers. It stood in the open now, undeniable. The twins looked down at the cloth and back up at the giant. Their expressions hardened, anger masking the first cracks of fear. "This means nothing," one said loudly. "You think this changes anything?" The giant did not respond. Instead, he turned slowly, deliberately, and looked at the workers, at the guards, at the witnesses. Then he opened his arms, an invitation, a challenge. The air seemed to hold its breath. One worker stepped forward, then another. Someone spoke, words tumbling out in a rush of years-long silence. Accusations followed. Stories spilled free, unchecked now that the door had been opened. The twins shouted, threatened, ordered, but their voices no longer carried the same weight. Control, once absolute, slipped through their fingers. The giant stepped back, allowing the moment to unfold. He did not need to fight. He did not need to shout. The truth did the work for him. As authorities were summoned and tension mounted, the twins realized something they had never considered before. They were no longer alone at the top. Fear had changed sides. From a distance hidden among the trees, the woman watched. She saw her son standing tall, unmoving, a silent force at the center of chaos. Tears filled her eyes, not of sadness but of release. For the first time in her life, someone had listened and for the first time in the twins' lives, the world had not bent. This was not the end. Not yet, but the beginning of their fall had been written into the ground beneath their feet, and it would not be erased. The twins had ruled by fear for so long that they mistook silence for loyalty. They stood there now, surrounded by workers who no longer looked at the ground, guards who hesitated instead of obeyed, and a towering man who hadn't spoken a single word, yet somehow controlled the entire space. This was unfamiliar territory, and unfamiliarity to men like them felt dangerous. "Enough!" one of the twins barked, stepping forward, voice sharp, desperate to reclaim authority. "You are all forgetting your place." No one moved. That was when anger replaced confidence. The other twin reached for a weapon, not because he needed it, but because it made him feel powerful again. The weight of it in his hand reminded him of the old balance, the way things were supposed to be. The giant noticed, not the weapon itself, but the intent. He shifted his stance slightly, grounding himself, feet planted firm against the earth. He wasn't preparing to attack. He was preparing to endure, to protect. The workers saw it, they felt it, and something dangerous happened. Someone spoke. She didn't deserve that. The voice came from the back of the crowd, shaky but loud enough. Heads turned, eyes widened. No one had dared speak like that before. The twins spun toward the sound. "Who said that?" Silence answered him again. But this time it was different. Another voice followed. Then another, "You beat her for nothing. She did nothing wrong. You've done worse to others." Each word landed like a crack in glass. The twins shouted over them, threats spilling out faster now, their authority unraveling with every accusation. They ordered guards forward, demanded arrests, promised punishment, but power doesn't survive exposure. The giant stepped forward once more, placing himself between the twins and the workers. He raised one massive hand, not in violence but in warning. "Stop." The gesture was clear, universal. One of the guards lunged. It happened fast, too fast. The guard raised his weapon, swinging with panic rather than purpose. The giant caught his arm mid-motion, fingers closing like iron around bone. There was a sickening crunch, not loud but final. The weapon fell. The guard screamed. The sound echoed across the estate. The giant released him immediately, stepping back, hands open, as if to say this is as far as it goes, but the damage was done. The twins stared in disbelief. "You see?" one shouted. "He's violent. He's dangerous." They were wrong. What followed wasn't chaos, it was clarity. The workers didn't scatter. They didn't run. They stood firmer, closer together. Fear still lived in their chests, but now it shared space with something else, resolve. The giant turned slowly and faced the crowd again. He touched his chest, then made a gesture. A story told without words. A story of pain, of watching, of remembering. Then he pointed back at the twins. Understanding rippled outward. This wasn't rebellion. This was testimony. The twins realized too late that they had lost control of the narrative. They tried to retreat, ordering gates closed, guards repositioned. But authority works only when believed, and belief had fractured beyond repair. One twin hissed to the other, low and urgent. "We need to end this. Now." That was the mom. NT. They made their worst decision. They ordered the giant seized. Several guards rushed forward, fear driving their movements. The giant braced himself, unwilling to strike unless forced. One guard grabbed him from behind. The giant reacted instinctively, throwing the man off with a single motion. The guard hit the ground hard and didn't rise. Gasps filled the air. The twins seized on it instantly. "There!" one shouted. "You all saw it. He's attacking!" They raised their voices, spinning the moment, twisting the truth the way they always had. But this time, witnesses stood everywhere, and justice has a way of remembering details power hopes to erase. A distant sound cut through the tension. Hooves, then voices. Authorities arrived faster than expected, drawn by the gunshots, the unrest. the sheer impossibility of ignoring what was happening. Horses pulled up hard at the edge of the estate. Officials dismounted. Confusion etched across their faces as they took in the scene. A giant, injured guards, workers standing together, two wealthy men shouting over everyone. "What is going on here?" one officer demanded. The twins rushed forward immediately, talking over each other, presenting their version of events with practiced ease. A dangerous runaway, an attack, a necessary response. But the workers spoke too, one by one. Then all at once, stories poured out. Years of abuse, cruelty, punishment, names, dates, faces. The truth expanded faster than the twins could contain it. The giant stood silently, allowing it all to happen. At the edge of the crowd, unseen by most, the woman arrived. She had followed as best she could, drawn by instinct and fear. When she saw her son standing, there, calm, controlled, surrounded by voices finally telling the truth, she wept, not from fear, from release. The officers listened. Their expressions hardened. What they were hearing didn't sound like a single incident. It sounded like a pattern. And patterns are dangerous to men who rely on silence. The twins realized their mistake too late. Violence had exposed them. Truth had trapped them. They were no longer facing one silent woman. They were facing everyone. As officials began separating people, taking statements, securing the scene, one of the twins locked eyes with the giant. Hatred burned there, but beneath it, something else flickered. Fear. Because for the first time, power had failed them. And the giant hadn't even raised his voice. This wasn't the end of the conflict. It was the point of no return. Somewhere deep inside the twins, a realization settled in. Slow, heavy, unavoidable. They had tried to crush a moment. Instead, they had created a movement. The estate no longer felt like a place of power. It felt like a crime scene. Authorities moved through the grounds slowly, deliberately, as if the land itself might speak if they listened closely enough. Guards stood apart now, uncertain, avoiding eye contact. Workers gathered in small clusters, whispering, pointing, remembering things they had never dared to remember out loud. The twins watched it all unfold from a distance, their confidence eroding with every passing minute. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. They had controlled stories their entire lives, controlled who spoke, who stayed silent, who disappeared quietly without questions being asked. They believed the past was something you company. Old lock away, that if enough time passed, truth would rot and crumble on its own. They were wrong. One of the officers approached the giant cautiously, notebook in hand. He spoke slowly, clearly, over-enunciating every word, unaware that sound itself meant nothing here. The giant watched his lips, his expression calm, unreadable. The officer hesitated, then gestured toward his ears. "Can you hear me?" The giant shook his head once. A murmur passed through the group. Deaf. The detail changed something, not just in the officer's eyes, but in everyone watching. A massive man, silent not by choice but by birth. A figure many had feared suddenly looked human, vulnerable. The officer adjusted his approach, speaking through gestures, asking simple questions. The giant responded in kind, slow movements, careful expressions. Communication took effort, but effort was finally being made. Then the officer asked the question no one had dared to voice yet. "Where did you come from?" The giant's eyes shifted, not away, but inward. He turned and looked toward the woman standing at the edge of the crowd. She froze when she realized all eyes were suddenly on her. Her instinct was to shrink back, to disappear into the background like she always had. But this time she didn't. She stepped forward. The officers recognized her immediately. Bruises still marked her face. Her arm was bandaged crudely, stained where blood had soaked through earlier. She stood beside her son, placing a hand against his chest, grounding herself. And then, with gestures slow and deliberate, She began to tell a story that had been buried for nearly 2 decades. She told them about his birth, how he never cried when loud noises filled the air, how he never turned his head when his name was called, how people said he was broken, cursed, useless, how they said a deaf child would never survive in a world built on shouted orders and sudden violence. But he survived. He grew stronger, taller, smarter in ways no one expected. He watched people closely, learned patterns, read faces. He learned where danger lived and how to avoid it, until danger came looking for him. The officers listened as the story darkened. She told them about the night the twins noticed him for the first time, how they laughed at his size, mocked his silence, treated him like an animal to be tested, how they ordered him beaten for not responding quickly enough to shouted commands he couldn't hear, how he fought back, not out of rebellion, but fear. A guard had gone down that night, badly hurt, maybe permanently injured. Panic followed, whispers spread. A story was crafted quickly, efficiently. The boy was dangerous, uncontrollable, a threat. She told them how they dragged him away before dawn, how they told her he had been sold far away, how she never saw proof, never received a name or a place or a reason, just silence, and how weeks later she heard rumors that the twins had ordered him killed. The estate grew deathly quiet. The officers exchanged looks. This wasn't just abuse. This was attempted murder. Possibly worse. The kind of thing wealth could hide but not erase. The giant stood motionless as his mother spoke, jaw clenched, eyes dark. He had lived this story, carried it in his body, in scars hidden beneath clothing, in instincts sharpened by survival. He had not been sold. He had escaped, barely. Thus, night they tried to kill him. He ran into the woods bleeding, half-conscious, driven by nothing but the need to live. He wandered for days, survived on water and instinct, avoided roads, avoided people. Eventually he found refuge with those who didn't fear his silence, those who taught him how to survive in a world that had rejected him. The officers absorbed every detail, then one of them turned slowly toward the twins. Their faces had gone pale. "You ordered a deaf boy beaten," the officer said evenly, and then removed him without record. One twin opened his mouth, but no words came. The other tried. "This is nonsense," he snapped. "A story, a fabrication. They're lying," but his voice shook, and liars can hear it when their own words stop convincing even themselves. More workers stepped forward now. Others who remembered the boy, who remembered the night he vanished, who remembered being warned not to ask questions. Piece by piece, the past assembled itself in the open air. The twins realized something horrifying. This was no longer about one incident. This was about a pattern, a history. The officers began writing furiously. Names were noted, dates recorded, guards separated and questioned individually. Pressure mounted. The giant watched it all, silent, steady. He had not come for revenge. He had come for truth, and truth, once spoken, does not return quietly to the grave. As dusk approached, the estate felt smaller, claustrophobic. The twins stood together now, no longer towering figures, but men boxed in by their own actions. One of them whispered, barely audible, "We should have finished it." The giant saw his lips move, understood, and for the first time so. Mething flickered across his face. Not rage, pity. Because men who believe the past can be buried never realize one thing until it's too late. The past waits, patiently, and when it rises it does not come alone. It brings consequences. The twins had always believed in one thing above all else. Money fixes problems. It had fixed judges. It had fixed records. It had fixed witnesses who suddenly forgot what they had seen. So when the truth began spilling out across their estate, like oil on water, their instinct wasn't panic. It was negotiation. They waited until nightfall, until most of the workers had been dismissed under official supervision, until the officers grew tired and the tension dulled into routine. That was when one of the twins requested a private conversation. He didn't ask politely. He assumed. Inside the grand house, away from listening ears, he poured drinks with shaking hands and forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The officer across from him noticed everything. The stiffness, the sweat, the urgency masked as confidence. "These are serious allegations," the officer said calmly. "Allegations," the twin repeated, nodding. "Exactly. Stories get exaggerated. Emotions run high. People misunderstand things." He slid a folded document across the table. Inside was a promise. Land rights, compensation, donations, enough money to make discomfort disappear. "We all want this handled quietly," the twin continued. "For everyone's sake." The officer pushed the paper back. "People were hurt," he replied, "and some never came back." The twin's smile tightened. "And dragging this out helps who, exactly?" That was the moment he crossed the line. Outside, the giants say, tea on the steps, watching shadows stretch across the lawn. He couldn't hear the conversation, but he didn't need to. He had seen this dance before. He had lived its consequences. The woman stood beside him, her hand resting lightly against his arm. She felt the tension in his body, the restraint, the discipline holding something dangerous in check. She squeezed his arm once, a reminder. Inside the house, the second twin grew impatient. "You're making a mistake," he snapped at another officer. "Do you know who we are?" The officer looked him in the eye. "I know who you were." The words landed hard. The twins hadn't expected resistance. Not like this. Not from people who were supposed to understand how the world worked. They regrouped quickly. If money wouldn't silence everyone, fear might. Late that night, as authorities prepared to leave with statements and evidence, a fire broke out near the workers' quarters. Small at first, then growing. Chaos followed. Shouts, movement, confusion. An accident, they claimed. No one believed it. The giant was the first to move. He ran toward the fire without hesitation, ripping apart burning wood, pulling people free, carrying the injured to safety as flames licked the sky. His strength turned panic into survival, and everyone saw it. Not a monster, not a threat, a protector. By the time the fire was extinguished, the twins' plan had backfired spectacularly. What was meant to distract had exposed them further. The officers were done. "You're both coming with us," one said flatly. The twins protested, threatened, promised consequences. None of it mattered now. As they were led away, bound not by chains but by accountability, one of the Tabo-ins turned back toward the giant. Hatred burned in his eyes, mixed with disbelief. "You think this ends with us?" He spat. The giant met his gaze. Then slowly, deliberately, he shook his head. No, this wasn't the end. It was only the moment when the world finally started paying attention. Behind them, the estate stood dark and damaged. Its illusion of control burned away. The workers watched in silence, not out of fear this time, but awe. The woman leaned into her son's side, exhaustion finally overtaking her. For the first time in her life, she felt something close to safety. But the giant knew better. Power doesn't die quietly, and men who lose everything rarely accept it without a fight. Somewhere in the distance, consequences were already gathering speed. Freedom never arrives all at once. It comes in fragments, in fragile moments that feel borrowed, temporary, almost unreal. And for the woman standing beside her son that night, freedom felt exactly like that. Something she was allowed to touch, but not yet hold. As the authorities escorted the twins away from the estate, a strange calm settled over the land. The workers stood quietly, unsure whether to celebrate or brace themselves. Too many times before, justice had appeared briefly, only to vanish by morning. This time felt different, but different didn't always mean safe. The giant sensed it before anyone else did. He stood at the edge of the property, watching the darkness beyond the fence line. His eyes followed every movement, every flicker of shadow. Years of surviving alone had taught him a hard truth. Danger doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it waits, sometimes it wears a uniform, sometimes it smiles. The woman noticed his tension. She touched his arm, questioning with her eyes. He shook his head slight. Lie. Not yet. By dawn, the whispers had already begun. Word of the twins' arrest spread fast, but not in the way anyone hoped. Powerful men don't fall quietly, and they rarely fall alone. Allies surfaced quickly. Investors, distant relatives, officials whose names had never been spoken aloud. By mid-morning, new faces arrived at the estate. They wore clean clothes, polished boots, calm expressions. Men who introduced themselves as representatives. Men who spoke in measured tones about procedure, jurisdiction, and misunderstandings. The giant watched them closely. They never looked at him directly. Instead, they spoke to the officers, to each other, to the air around him, as if refusing to acknowledge his presence might erase the problem he represented. One of them gestured vaguely in his direction. "That man should be detained," he said casually, "for everyone's safety." The word hit the air like a threat. The woman stiffened. The giant felt it too. Officers hesitated. Papers were produced. Questions were raised about identification, about legality, about where the giant had been for the last several years. The tone shifted subtly but unmistakably, from investigation to control. They asked the woman to step aside, just for a moment, just to clarify a few things. She had heard those words before. Her breathing quickened. Memories flooded back. Rooms with no windows, questions designed to trap, promises that led nowhere. She looked at her son, panic rising in her chest. He stepped closer to her without hesitation. One of the officials frowned. "Sir, you need to move back." The giant didn't, not aggressively, not defiantly. He simply stayed where he was. Silence etched. The officials exchanged looks, irritation creeping in. One of them tried again, louder this time, more forceful. "You're interfering with an official process." The giant tilted his head slightly, reading lips carefully. Then he shook his head once. "No." The officer's jaw tightened. He reached for the giant's arm. That was when everything nearly fell apart. The giant caught the officer's wrist gently, not crushing, not violent, but firm enough to make the message clear. "Do not touch her." The air exploded with tension. Hands went to weapons. Voices rose. Orders were shouted. Words the giant couldn't hear, but whose intent he felt ripple through the crowd. The woman gasped, tears spilling freely now. She grabbed her son's arm, shaking her head frantically. "Please, not again." The giant released the officer immediately and stepped back, raising both hands. He wasn't here to fight the system. He was here to survive it. A senior officer intervened just in time, shouting orders, forcing space between everyone involved. "Enough," he snapped. "No one is being detained without cause." The officials protested. Threatened, cited connections, the senior officer didn't budge. And just like that, the moment passed. Barely. But the damage was done. The message was clear. The twins might be gone, but the system that protected them was still very much alive. That night, the woman couldn't sleep. Every sound made her flinch. Every shadow felt like a warning. She sat awake, staring at the door, waiting for it to open, waiting for men to come and take everything back. The giant sat across from her, unmoving, keeping watch. She signed to him slowly, shakily. Was it a mistake to come be? "Ak?" He didn't answer right away. Then he placed his hand over hers and shook his head. No. But his eyes told a harder truth. This fight wasn't over. Far from it. Outside, beyond the estate, powerful conversations were already happening behind closed doors. Calls were being made. Favors were being called in. The twins' influence reached farther than anyone wanted to admit, and at the center of it all stood a silent man who refused to disappear. By morning, New orders arrived. The woman was to be relocated for her own protection. The giant was to be separated from her temporarily. Everything was framed as concern. The oldest lie power tells itself. The woman broke down when she heard. Her body shook with sobs she could no longer contain. She clung to her son, terrified that history was repeating itself, that the world was once again tearing them apart. The giant felt something crack inside him. Not rage, fear. The kind that comes from knowing how easily people like them could be erased. He signed to her carefully, slowly, "I will not leave you." And for the first time since this all began, the system hesitated. Because the truth had spread too far now. Too many eyes were watching. Too many voices were involved. Removing them quietly was no longer an option, not without consequences. That realization settled heavily over everyone present. The woman leaned her forehead against her son's chest, breathing him in, grounding herself in the reality of his presence. For now, they were still together. For now, they were still standing. But the giant understood something deeply, something the system hoped he wouldn't. When power feels cornered, it doesn't surrender, it adapts, and the next move would be quieter, cleaner, and far more dangerous. The world outside the plantation had a way of pretending it didn't exist. For years, the estate had operated like a closed system, its own rules, its own justice, its own silence. What happened inside its fences stayed there, buried beneath routine and fear. But systems built on secrecy collapse the moment light gets in. And light had finally found a way through. It started small. A local reporter arrived early that morning, notebook tucked under one arm, curiosity written plainly across her face. She hadn't been invited. No one had expected her. But rumors had a way of traveling faster than influence, and what had happened at the estate was no longer something people could whisper about quietly. An arrest, a giant, a deaf man who stood against wealth without speaking. Stories like that don't stay contained. The woman watched from the porch as the reporter approached, her heart racing. Public attention was unfamiliar and terrifying. She had spent her entire life trying not to be seen. Now the world was turning its gaze toward her. She instinctively reached for her son. He stood beside her, steady, unmoving, eyes alert. The reporter introduced herself calmly, respectfully, careful not to push too hard. She asked simple questions at first, about the incident, about the arrests, about the rumors spreading through the county. The woman struggled to answer verbally. Words felt heavy, fragile. The reporter noticed immediately and turned her attention toward the giant. "You don't have to speak," she said gently. "You can show me." And for the first time, someone outside the system was willing to listen on his RMs. The giant hesitated. Attention meant risk. Exposure meant consequences. But silence had already cost them everything once before. He nodded. Using gestures, expressions, movements slow and deliberate, he began to tell their story again. Not just to authorities, but to the public. The reporter watched closely, taking notes, asking clarifying questions, adapting as she went. The woman filled in what she could, her voice shaking but determined. Together they painted a picture no amount of money could easily erase: abuse, disappearance, survival. The reporter's expression changed as the story unfolded. What had started as curiosity hardened into resolve. "This needs to be told," she said quietly. By afternoon, the first article went live. It didn't name everyone. It didn't accuse recklessly. It simply laid out the facts. A powerful family, a long history of allegations, a deaf man whose disappearance raised serious questions, a mother whose injuries were documented and undeniable. The response was immediate. Phones rang. Emails poured in. People who had worked on the estate years earlier began reaching out anonymously. Similar stories surfaced from neighboring properties owned by the same network. A pattern emerged, and patterns scare institutions more than isolated incidents ever could. The twins' allies panicked. Statements were drafted, denials prepared, legal teams mobilized. But the story had already escaped the control of any one voice. By evening, regional outlets picked it up, then national. The giant watched it unfold on a small screen inside the house, images flickering silently. Headlines rolled by, bold and unmistakable. Deaf man at center of abuse invest. Igation, wealth, silence, and a missing boy. When power forgets who it's watching. The woman covered her mouth, overwhelmed. "Is this real?" she whispered. The giant nodded. Yes, but attention came with a cost. As night fell, tension returned, heavier now, sharper. Vehicles passed the estate slowly. Strangers lingered at the edges of the property. Not all eyes were friendly. Some were curious. Others were calculating. A man approached the gate just after dark, flashing credentials no one recognized. He claimed to represent interested parties. He spoke politely, but his message was clear. This has gone too far. The giant watched him from a distance, expression unreadable. He didn't approach. He didn't engage. The man left shortly after, but the warning lingered. Inside, the woman trembled. "I don't want this," she admitted softly. "I just wanted it to stop." The giant knelt in front of her, meeting her eyes. Slowly, carefully, he signed. "It will only stop if the truth stays loud." She nodded, tears streaming freely now. By morning, the estate was unrecognizable. News vans lined the road. Cameras rolled. Reporters gathered, asking questions, calling names, demanding answers. The system had lost control of the narrative, and it showed. Officials arrived, faces tight, movements cautious. Every decision now carried weight. Every action could be filmed, questioned, replayed. The woman stepped forward unexpectedly. When a reporter asked her if she wanted to say something, she hesitated, then nodded. Her voice was quiet, shaky, but clear. "I stayed silent because I was afraid," she said. "I'm not afraid anymore." The words rippled outward, carried by microphones and screens into living rooms across the country. The giant stood behind her, hand resting lightly on her shoulder. For the first time, he was seen not as a threat, but as a shield, somewhere far away, in a room where influence usually worked unseen. Powerful people watched the broadcast unfold, and they realized something chilling. This was no longer a local problem. It was a symbol. And symbols are dangerous, because once people recognize them, they stop being afraid of who's in charge. The story had gone public, and power was running out of places to hide. By sunrise, the world had already shifted. News of the estate, the arrests, the mother and her deaf son had traveled further than anyone could have predicted. Social media exploded with fragments of the story, clips from the reporter, images of the fire, descriptions of abuse and survival. Every share, every comment, every retweet spread the truth faster than the twins' influence could contain it. But influence doesn't vanish quietly. From the shadows of wealth and politics, allies of the twins began acting. Lawyers arrived with stacks of documents, threatening lawsuits, demanding retractions, questioning identities, twisting narratives with practiced ease. Officials who had seemed cooperative now hesitated, caught between procedure and old loyalties. The mother watched all of it unfold from the porch, trembling. Her heart raced as men in suits demanded private meetings, statements, assurances. Their voices were calm, smooth, polite, but she felt the weight behind each word, the implied threat that obedience was safer than resistance. The giant stood behind her, unmoving, like a sentinel carved from stone. He had seen power twist itself before, seen threats disguised as civility. He understood it all without a single word. The first challenge came that afternoon. A group of officials arrived at the estate, led by a man who introduced himself as a mediator. His tone was careful, neutral, but his message was simple. We need cooperation. Any misstep, and you will face consequences. The mother swallowed hard. She glanced at her son, who watched the visitors carefully, his posture unyielding. Even silent, he exuded presence. The mediator continued, "There are allegations of false claims, interference with investigation, and, in some reports, threats. We must resolve this before it escalates." The words landed like hammers. Threats wrapped in civility, legal power masked as diplomacy. The mother spoke softly, her voice barely above the wind. "We only want the truth to be known." The mediator raised an eyebrow. Truth is rarely so simple. Meanwhile, the giant moved closer to the visitors, not aggressively, but steadily. His size alone drew attention. Guards flinched. Officials shifted uncomfortably. He didn't need to say a word. His presence conveyed more authority than theirs. Then it happened. One of the mediator's aides suddenly accused the giant of intimidation, of using physical presence to manipulate witnesses. Claims were exaggerated. Words were chosen carefully to frame him as a threat. Gasps rippled through the room. Some workers looked uneasy, remembering the fire, the chaos, the sheer size of the man. The mother's hand shot out to steady him. "You're lying," she signed forcefully, her voice trembling. The giant did not respond verbally. He did not raise his hands. He simply leaned slightly forward, calm and deliberate, demonstrating control, every movement measured, no aggression, no panic. The mediator pressed further. "We must take action to ensure safety. Restraining orders, separation, legal intervention." A sharp look from the giant froze him mid-sentence. It wasn't rage, it wasn't threat, it was certainty. Control without chaos. The mother nodded, signing quickly, "Do not escalate. Calm." "Wait." The giant obeyed. He stepped back, relaxed. But the room could feel the weight of potential consequences hanging like a storm cloud over everyone present. Silence followed. Then, from the back, a worker stepped forward, pointing to the evidence. Photographs, the mother's injuries, the fire aftermath, the twins' behavior, the witnesses who had spoken. Each piece of truth dismantled the carefully constructed lies. The mediator's voice faltered. His argument lost momentum under the weight of undeniable facts. Papers shuffled. Phones buzzed. Messages arrived mid-conversation. The world was watching. By evening, the mediator and his group left, not defeated, but careful. Caution replaced confidence. The twins' allies were recalibrating, realizing that public exposure had stripped them of the usual tools: silence, intimidation, bribery. The mother exhaled, leaning into her son, exhaustion and relief washing over her. She finally allowed herself to cry openly, releasing the fear she had held tight for so long. The giant signed softly, "We are not safe yet, but we are stronger." Outside, shadows moved along the estate boundaries, a subtle reminder that threats still lingered, silent and patient. The mother understood. The son understood. But tonight, for the first time, they realized something fundamental. Fears no longer one-sided. The giant's presence alone had shifted the balance. Lies could be spun, threats issued, influence called upon, but truth, once amplified publicly, could not be contained. And those who underestimated it would learn the hardest lesson: control is fragile. Exposure is relentless. Justice doesn't always arrive neatly, but it cannot be denied forever. Night fell. The estate lay quiet. For the first time in years, silence didn't feel suffocating. It felt temporary, patient, like a calm before the inevitable storm, because the storm was coming, and it would arrive louder, faster, and in ways no one could ignore. By mid-morning, the estate had become a chessboard. Every movement, every glance, every whispered conversation was calculated. The twins, though absent physically, remained present in every strategy their allies deployed. Their influence was subtle, refined, but dangerous, the kind of influence money and reputation buys in shadows. A series of letters arrived that morning, thin envelopes marked with authority and urgency. Officials, guided by the twins' lawyers, demanded interviews, questioning, and careful documentation. It was an attempt to regain control, to manipulate perceptions, and to shape public narrative. The giant studied the envelopes, silent. The woman standing at his side felt the tension in him. She knew that each letter, each subtle threat was more than paperwork. It was a test of their resolve, a trap waiting for a misstep. She whispered, "Do not act hastily." He nodded, acknowledging her words. Later that day, one of the twins' political allies appeared at the estate. Off. Ishali, he came to mediate.